Hello everybody, this is Brian Eslick here from How To Automotive. Today I'm going to walk you through the process of doing rear brakes on a 2010 Mercedes GL450. We'll start by lifting the vehicle, supporting it. I got it on my hoist, so for you guys at home, floor jacks work great with jack stands. You'll need a 17mm socket to get the lug nuts off. The next step is we need to remove this anti-rattle clip here. And to do that, the easiest way is to get a screwdriver, put it in between, and pry it like so, and then pull it out with your fingers. After that, we're going to go onto the back of the caliper. On the back of the caliper, and we're going to remove these little caps from the slider pins here. One on the top, one on the bottom. Remove those. Then we'll look back here and determine if it's a Torx or an Allen. One of the things I like to do before I take the bolts out of the calipers is put a little screwdriver in the caliper like so, and give it a light little pry, and that puts a gap between the pads, so that way when you take the bolts out, the caliper slides right off really easy. Okay, after removing the bolts, the 7mm Allens it turned out to be, you're gonna take your caliper and flip it up out of the way. Now what you need to do is you need to compress the piston back in. I choose to use a caliper pressing tool and it presses it in, and I leave the bleeder screws closed. Some people like to open the bleeder screws when they do this and push the pistons in, and the brake fluid will come out. But then after you're done, with the brake job, you'll need to bleed the brake system. If you leave the bleeders closed, the pistons will push back in, and you will not have to bleed the brakes after it's done. So that's why I choose it to do that way. Now, one method to get the calipers back in is to use a C-clamp like so, and to push the pistons back in, or a large pair of channel locks, if you have those, works great too. So once you get the pistons pulled back in, the next step would be to remove the brake caliper cage that goes around the rotor here from your old pad. One other thing I wanted to mention is I like to hang the caliper up on the suspension, hang it up out of your way. If it's one of those ones that constantly tries to fall back down, use a bungee cord or something to hold it down. You try not to put any stress on the actual brake hoses itself. Even though these are made out of aluminum and they're very light, you just don't want to risk damaging the brake hoses. So just hang it up out of your way. And now on the cages here, it's an 18mm bolt that you need to get back to the bolt the cage on. So set your ratchet up and take the cage off. In this case, I'm on the right side, so I'm going to take the bottom bolt loose first, and the top bolt. If you took the top bolt out first and then tried to unloosen the bottom bolt, this whole thing would rotate. It would flip out like that, and give you a little trouble. So it's better, or just to crack both of them free, both nuts free, before you start really trying to take the caliper cage off. So now that the bolts are out, this is what the cage looks like. One of the things you want to do before you put it back together is take a little wire brush and clean the channels that the brake pads ride in. And you can apply a slight little thin layer of lubricant on there. I don't like to put too much, because what happens is dust and dirt builds up on it, and the actual lubricant on the lubricant, and it'll actually prevent the brake pads from actually sliding. So a very thin little layer is all you need. Okay, now we need to remove the brake rotor. In this case, I'm going to machine the rear rotors on this Mercedes GL. On the rear brakes, you can get away with machining on German cars, but on the front brakes, pretty much is almost mandatory that you replace the rotors, because they develop these large lips and grooves on it. But this one's in really good shape, and it measured out in perfect spec. So we're going to machine this rotor. But if you choose, you can just replace the rotor, and it was just a matter of unbolting the one bolt here and taking the rotor off and putting the new rotor back on. Now, when I went to take this torque out, it was really tight and stuff, so I had to get out my impact screwdriver. This one's made by Snap-on, but Craftsman, Cornwell, a lot of other tools you can get this. You might even get these at Harbor Freight. Anyway, so what you do is you put the tool in there and you strike it in the back with a hammer, and it releases the pressure for you. to get the screw out. And if you notice on Mercedes-Benz, they have all this on all the bolts on their brakes. They have the blue stuff. That is Loctite thread sealer. It's kind of like a glue, and it prevents the bolts from vibrating back out, coming out. So when you go put these back together, it's a good idea to put new thread sealer on there. One of the tips I wanted to give you guys is when you take the bolt out and the rotor doesn't want to come off like so, if you take your hammer and you hit the hub right here, just like that, and it pops it free. So if you guys don't have access to a brake machine, what you could do is take it down to a company like, or a local mechanic shop, and give it to them, and they'll charge you, a couple dollars to machine the rotor for you. You just drop it off, tell them what year, make, and model, they'll measure it for you, and tell you if they're in spec, and it's well worth the money. So if they're going to machine your rotor, it's worth the money. On the Mercedes, the parking brake shoes are on the inside, and they work like a drum system. So when you put your new rotor back on, you would just want to feel a slight little drag as you turn this. So if it doesn't have a slight little drag, you want to adjust your adjuster screw here until it has a slight little drag. You may take the rotor on, off several times, rotating it and turning it back and forth to make sure it has a slight little drag on the pads. And that's all you need. You don't need them super tight, just a slight drag. So now that you got your rotor machined, or you got your brand new rotor you're going to put back on, before you do, you want to put a little blue Loctite, like I said, on the threads of the bolts, like so. Just a little dab is all you need. And then put your rotor back on, and put your bolt back in. So after putting a little blue Loctite on the bolts for the cage, put the cage back on is the next step. And torque that down, tighten that down. And one of the keys to not having squeaks in your brake job is try not to touch the actual surface of the rotor. So after bolting your rotor up and your cage back up, so now you're ready to remove your brake pads, your inner pads. On the passenger side, it has a sensor, a pad warning sensor that tells you when you need brakes. And all you do is on the caliper itself. It has a pad lining sensor. It tells you when you need brakes. So all you do is wiggle it out of the thing, like so, and then pull your pad out like so. So now with your new pad, you're going to put the new sensor in the pad before you reinstall it on the caliper. It pushes in with just a little clip, but you want the little nipple side facing the brake pad. That's where it actually touches and makes contact and turns the light on. So after that, what I like to do is I put a little thin layer of special grease. It's called Seal Glide. You can get it at your parts store. It's like a silicone-based grease. You put a thin layer on the back of the brake pads, and be careful not to touch the front of the pads or the rotors, because if you get grease on either one of them, you potentially have a squeak. So after putting your brake pad back into the caliper, the next step is to put the outer pad on, like so. And also don't forget to put a slight thin layer of Seal Glide grease in the tracks here. Just a thin layer is all you need. And then after that, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the pins, the bolts that our calipers go on. Remove them like so. And we're going to put a little bit of that Seal Glide grease on these too. Maybe put a little bit on the back inside this little rubber boot here. And that'll keep the caliper sliding back and forth so it won't stick. Okay, after lubing your slide pins and rebolting the calipers back on, the next step is to plug in your brake pad sensor. So to plug it in, you just take it like so and push. And that's it. Okay, we're almost done now. To finish off the brakes, we need to put our anti-rattle clip back on. And the way I do that is I angle it like so, and I put the little ears on the outside of the caliper cage here, and I push. With just my fingers and rotate it in just like that. And you just got to make sure that the little catches are here or in there. And if they are and they're secure, give it a little pull like that and it doesn't come back off, they're good. And that's how you do the rear brakes on your Mercedes 450 GL. And as always, it's my pleasure sharing my experience with you guys. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, or you can email me and I'll leave that link in the description. And I do respond and I'll get back to you. And if you have any suggestions on videos or need any more help, hit me up. Thank you again.